Hey, everybody, it's Justin. Today, Tim is going to equip us about the importance of curiosity and obedience in responding to God's call. He uses the story of Moses to illustrate how calling is rooted in God's initiative and communal participation. All of this sets the stage for our One Church Leaders Gathering on August 27th from 9 a.m. till noon at the Sheraton Valley Forge. Don't let your registration get lost in the shuffle of the summer. Head over to netzer.org/gather right now. Our time together will be marked with worship, breakfast, connection, table discussions, and more. netzer.org/gather. And even if you're not able to make it on August 27th, you're going to glean a lot from today's episode. So may your identity be rooted in God's story and not your own accomplishments. Let's get into it.
See, if our confidence is in ourselves, it's pride. If we think that the calling is just about me, then we're going to be afraid because the calling's too big. If we go into communal calling with others and we think it's about the others, then we're tempted to either be codependent or to be competitive in our callings, when in fact the place where our confidence is supposed to be is that this calling is that we get to join in the thing that God is doing to set his people free. Hey friends, looking forward to being with all of you on August 27th for the Leaders Gathering. As we prepare for it, I'd like to meditate a little bit together on the idea of calling, which might seem a little bit silly because if you're a leader, you're already walking in calling. But I think that our understanding of our calling shapes so much about how we do ministry, how we interact with the Lord, how we interact with each other, how we interact with the people that we serve. For me, the idea of calling got shaped pretty early in my life. I was raised in a Christian environment, so we would have these moments that, at the end of a missions conference or after going on a missions trip or maybe the end of a youth retreat where there'd be an altar call. People could accept Jesus into their heart. They could, get saved, or they could rededicate their life to the Lord. But then there was this other invitation, and it was, is God calling you to set apart ministry or to vocational ministry or to full-time ministry? And, that was a very individualistic thing. It was kind of this sense of, I think one of the things that tugged on my heart, I would imagine on others, was this was an offer for a sense of purpose, meaning, significance, maybe even a little bit of like legitimacy of like, you're pretty hardcore if you do this. But there was a sense of like, is God stirring in you to give yourself entirely to him? And what that meant at the time, I mean, a lot of the images we had of that were shaped by modern heroes of the faith, which were mostly missionaries or evangelists or reformers, that sort of thing. So it might be Hudson Taylor or Amy Carmichael, the Judsons or the Elliots, Jim and Elizabeth, or it might be George Whitefield, Charles Finney, or of course the more modern day Billy Graham. All these are like images that would kind of form in our minds this picture of, is God setting you aside to do something powerful? Is God calling you to do something amazing for him, and to give your life entirely to him? And this was an important and precious part of the call toward young people, essentially to say, are you going to step up and serve the Lord? And I think that was so important for many of us to really be challenged. But there was also some things about that I think needed to be refined. One of those things that I'm sure most of us listening to this would agree with is that the whole historic divide between clergy and laity that says calling for the set apart ministry is, those who are going to be pastors or missionaries are the ones on the front lines. And then Everybody else are the ones kind of supporting them from the sidelines in prayer and finances and that sort of thing. And I think the church has really come a long way from that, and believes at this point that there's a royal priesthood of all of us, and that all Christians are called, and that all sectors of society need believers to step into their calling at home, in their neighborhoods, in their workplaces, and in government, in the arts, in education, and in the marketplace, as much as institutional church and classical missions. And so I think that's been one real positive development in our understanding of calling, that calling's for everyone. And I think that's been a really important adjustment. But another thing that I want to tease out for us today is that I wonder sometimes if we think about calling too individualistically. I think that when we think about what's my calling, that it puts inside of us this sense of, I have to accomplish something. I have to become something. And for sure, there is a fair amount in the scripture that we realize we've been entrusted with a limited amount of time and with the spiritual gifts that we've been given. And what are we going to do with that? And that's a real question for us that we have to take care to look at with responsibility and prayerful contemplation. But sometimes I think it becomes for us a sense that this calling is really about us, that what calling means is that God wants us to do something or us to become something. And I think that might not be unimportant, but I think it might not be the first question. And I think that if it becomes the central question of calling, we start to lose perspective. I don't think calling is about our personal significance and our contribution. It's not about just fulfilling a specific mission for my life. I think that the biblical picture of calling is about joining God in what he's doing for his people together with others. Yes, playing our unique role, but the real point of this is it's a call to participate with the work that God is doing in meeting his people in the places where they need him. And I think one of the great pictures of this is the picture of Moses. And so I want to turn there and look at Moses and at his story in preparation for our time together. And one of the things I'd like us to do as we prepare for it is each to read from Exodus 2 to the beginning of Exodus chapter 6. And I think it'll really help fuel our conversations around the table. In chapter 2, it's setting the background for us of who Moses is and kind of what his struggles are. He's a guy who's raised in the palace, obviously, born into privilege, surrounded by oppression of his ethnic people. And we see the tension of that. I mean, I think that Moses, I would imagine, probably struggled to really know who his people were and where he belonged and what his role was. And we see that when he goes out that one day and sees the Egyptian beating this enslaved Hebrew, he lashes out, in anger, and he kills the Egyptian. And obviously that was him kind of internalizing this sense of injustice that he felt, but in his own time and in his own strength, trying to deal with it in a way that really doesn't fix anything. And so often I think our calling can initially be, we have these passions that we want to work out, and we're trying to find ways to do something with this driving passion we have inside of ourselves. And lots of that is fueled by our lack of identity and maybe a sense of trying to find some sort of legitimacy and make some sort of mark and contribution. And we can empathize with the pain that Moses felt and the anger he felt about the injustice. And we appreciate actually that Moses is a guy of action, even as a young person like this. I mean, when he runs and goes to Midian, he finds Jethro's daughters, including Zipporah's future wife, we assume, at the well, and they're being bullied by these shepherds who apparently consistently make it difficult for them. And Moses somehow comes and helps them out and defends them from these shepherds and allows them to access the well. And again, this is a guy, who's trying to use this privilege to help those who are in difficult situation and trying to fight for justice. And that's a really good thing inside of Moses. But as we get to the end of chapter 2, we really start to see what calling is about for Moses. This is where we begin to see context for his life, because the narrative shifts from being about Moses to being about God and his people. And it says that God's heard the oppression of his people, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He sees and he knows. This is for us how we begin to discover our calling, is to see ourselves in the context of God's heart for his people, not just what's the driving passion in me, not just how do I make an impact in a short period of time, but beginning to understand ourselves inside the story of God. And Moses at first doesn't know how this is going to work, but that's the context that we're reading as we're looking at the story. God is about to move on behalf of his people, and he's about to invite Moses to be a part of that. And so the story of Moses' calling doesn't start with Moses, it starts with God and his desire for his people. And I think for us as leaders in whatever sector we're in, we need to remember that it doesn't start with us. We're a part of an initiative that's started by God, and that he's the one leading it. He's the one initiating it. He's the one who's going to bring it to completion. He's inviting us to participate in it. That's the backdrop that leads into chapter 3 of Exodus, where we see this beautiful moment where God calls Moses, and it starts, of course, with this burning bush. And Moses, he's just doing his job. It says he's attending to his flock, and I think at this point maybe Moses is content to just not be a part of the politics of Egypt, and maybe he's kind of gotten into a rhythm where he has something that he can do. He's contributing. He's just doing his job. And perhaps he's maturing now. He's married and he's just kind of taking care of business. And I think we can easily get into routines in our life, which are really good, and feel comfortable in that. But God breaks into his routine, and there's the burning bush moment. And I don't know, as a kid with the flannel graphs and all the things I learned about this, I kind of pictured it like there's this blazing thing that like would have been impossible to miss. But the way the story reads, actually, it says, he came to Mount Horeb, the mountain of God, and the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame and a fire within a bush. And as Moses looked, he saw that the bush was on fire, but not consumed. So Moses thought, I must go over and look at this remarkable sight. Why isn't the bush burning up? And I think that there's something about Moses deciding, I'm going to go over and take a look at this, that's an important part of the story, because there's peculiarities that come into our mundane lives. And it's easy at times to either think they're annoying interruptions and we just kind of want to keep on with our day, or we get too easily consumed with our routine that we're not interested in seeing things new. But there's a sense of holy curiosity inside of Moses that says, I want to go and look at this. And that seems to please God. Because it says then, when the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called out to him and said from the bush, Moses, Moses. So God initiates this, but it's like he's baiting a hook, and he wants to see if there's still something inside of Moses that'll move toward him to join God. And I think this is, again, an important part of our calling, is we might be in our regular routine, doing our normal things, whether that's, working in the marketplace, caring for our kids, or pastoring the church, doing what we're doing. But then there's something that comes up, something in the news that keeps nagging us. There's a thought about something going on in the culture that we can't let go of. There's a peculiarity of something happening, a trend kind of happening in our people or in our neighborhood. And if our curiosity is willing to move past our status quo and say, what is that? And press in. Sometimes this is where God meets us in the call for today. because the call that we received when we went forward at that altar call when we were kids it might not be clear enough. There's a call of what is God doing today? What is he speaking into in this moment that I can participate in? And as Moses comes to seek out this burning bush, God sees his interest, speaks to him, and doesn't initially tell him what he's going to do. Initially, he calls him by name. We remember that God wants to encounter us personally. God knows us by name long before we accomplish something for him. Our calling is not about proving something to God. It's not about proving something to ourselves. Our identities are not in our calling or in our gifts. Our identities are in our name before God, that we are children of God. So God meets with him personally, tells him to take off his shoes. He's on holy ground. He encounters him. Moses is full of fear, and God comforts him and meets him in this place. And it's this really beautiful interaction. And God, when God identifies himself to Moses, he identifies himself in the legacy of Abraham, saying he's the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob. He helps Moses know that he's a part of a legacy. He's a part of a longer story, and that God's been with him for a long time. It's really a beautiful thing. And I think that this curiosity of Moses allows God to meet him in a place where he's joining in with God and God's responding to him. And he's taking that part of Moses that yearns for justice, and now he's kind of pulling that out and giving him a context for it when he says, I've heard my people crying and I've come down to do something about it. And this is where he's letting Moses know he gets to be a part of something. Again, this isn't, hey, I have a design for your life and I want you to fulfill this thing for your life. It's, I see injustice happening to my people and I want to free them. This is an embodied people. It's not just the idea of injustice that I want you to get angry about. I want you to love, be incarnational in a place and help bring freedom. I love the fact that ultimately God is going to be bringing Moses back to the same mountain. And he says it, I'm going to bring you, you're going to know that this was me, because after it's all said and done and I free my people from Egypt, we're going to come right back to this mountain. And at that point, it's going to be a sign to you that I was the one who did this. Moses isn't even anywhere close to being willing to accept the fact that he's the guy for this job yet. And God's already basically setting him up to say, at the end of this, you're not going to take credit for this because it's going to be back on this mountain. And I called my shot. I called where I was going to hit the home run. It's going to be right back here. I'm going to do the whole thing, and you're going to know that it was me because I called it. And when God brings the people back to Mount Sinai and forms the covenant with them, we call this the Mosaic covenant. But in reality, this isn't a covenant between Moses and God. This is a covenant between God and his people. And Moses is a mediator, a facilitator. But those of you who are pastors, you have a great example of this. It's a moment when you're standing at an altar with two people who are getting married. You're not forming a covenant with God here. They're forming a covenant together with one another and God. And they're the one who's forming the covenant. And it's actually the same way when we facilitate communion and the Lord's table and Eucharist. It's a moment where we're personally, as the ones facilitating that, if you're a pastor, you're not the one who's establishing the covenant or even the one confirming the covenant in the moment. This is people by eating the bread and by drinking the cup. They are remembering the covenant of their baptism and of Christ on the cross on their behalf. And what we remember about our calling is that this whole thing is something between God and his people. It's not about me and my life and what I'm doing with my life. It's about what God's doing with these people. So it's really important that I continue to see my calling as not something that's about me. Otherwise, I'm going to be tempted to work really hard at being impressive to God, to myself, or maybe to those around me. And I might be writing a story, but I'm going to be writing a story about my own life. There's this beautiful part of the narrative that comes after Moses' calling when the plagues are happening in Egypt. And, sign by sign, the Egyptian magicians are trying to match what Aaron is doing. And then it finally gets to this one spot where they can't match it when the gnats come and they realize they can't match what what's happening. And their statement is, this is the finger of God. Because they realize that what God is doing is writing a story. God writes with his finger. In fact, God writes the 10 Commandments with his finger. Like Jesus is writing the kingdom of God. He says it's the finger of God writing his kingdom into existence. And that he writes like that in that moment before the adulterous woman is about to be stoned and all of that. And Jesus is writing on the ground. We see the finger of God is the one who's writing this beautiful story. And we need to understand that our calling is not us writing a story with our lives to do something important or impressive or valuable. We need to understand that we are a part of a story. We are just one part, one character in a story that God is writing. And our willingness to yield to God, to be obedient to God is important, but it's not to try to accomplish something in order to be legitimate. And this is why it's so beautiful, because Moses initially is what this affords him is the ability to be a part of a team. And we so easily read the story like Moses, the greatest of the prophets and all of that, and make it about like those modern missionaries I thought of when I was a kid about, man, you got to be impressive like that. But when you read this whole narrative with Moses, here's the thing, is that God wanted Moses to be a part of a team. It was a communal calling. Sometimes we think that his call or that his partnership with Aaron was God's concession because Moses wasn't willing to do it on his own. Because we hear God's anger and disappointment over the fact that Moses won't receive with confidence the calling that God's giving him. But in fact, when you read the narrative, you see that God already talked to Aaron, and he's already sending Aaron on the way to meet with Moses. I believe the way this story reads is that God was planning on this being a partnership with Moses and Aaron, but he wanted Moses to have pure, bold confidence that this was about God, not about humans. But Moses was like, I can't do this. And God's like, yeah, but I'm going to be with you, And then he's like, I'm not one who's good with speech. And you see God starts to get frustrated because it's like, you think this is going to work because Aaron's joining you? Like, you need me and that's what you need. But God knows that for good, healthy communal partnership to happen, we need to have confidence in God. See, if our confidence is in ourselves, it's pride. If we think that the calling is just about me, then we're going to be afraid because the calling's too big. If we go into communal calling with others and we think it's about the others, then we're tempted to either be codependent or to be competitive in our callings. And we either need to be the impressive one to set ourselves apart from others, or we're afraid we can't accomplish it, so we're leaning too heavily on others. When in fact, the place where our confidence is supposed to be is that this calling is that we get to join in the thing that God is doing to set his people free. And all of us are a part of this calling together, which is why initially, yeah, he's talking to Moses, and that's the perspective we get in the narrative. But he's also actually, we're told, already had a conversation with Aaron, and Aaron's listened to him and responded to him. So it wasn't just Moses calling; he actually called Aaron too. And then he tells them they're supposed to go and talk to the leaders, the elders of Israel, and they're supposed to go together with these Hebrew elders to confront the Egyptian Pharaoh. And so he's a part of a team. There's the early adopters and the core team that he's supposed to form, And one of the important things about having the real perspective that our calling is way too big for us, it's even way too big for the community, that we are participating in something that God is doing. And we are to be interdependent, not codependent, and part of a team. But one of the things that's important about that level of dependency on God and that level of partnership with each other is when it comes to the difficult things that we're going to face in our calling, when it gets harder than it seems like it should have been, we need to remember that this isn't about our strength or our weaknesses. We need to remember this is about God. And Moses finds out really quickly, like early in this story, he and Aaron go and talk to the Hebrew elders, and they respond profoundly when they see the signs and they realize that God's seen them, and they fall on their faces and they worship the Lord, and they're so grateful. But then really quickly things change when they all go in front of Pharaoh, and invite Pharaoh to let them go into the wilderness. Pharaoh gets mad at them, doubles their labor, pulls back their straw, and makes things really difficult. And the elders turn against Moses and Aaron. What does Moses do? He runs back to God and essentially says, "You're not doing anything. This isn't working. Are you powerful enough to back up your words?" And by the way, again, I think you shouldn't have put me in this situation. He's like, I was really happy when I was just pastoring my flock and watching Netflix and hanging out with my wife and enjoying myself. I never really felt like doing this. What are you doing? And I think that this moment reminds us of the beauty of when this is about God and not us. We run back to God and we call God out and we say, "What's happening?" And that's what Moses does. And it leads us to the end of the calling portion of it, which is the first verse in chapter 6, where God says to Moses, "Now step back and watch what I will do to Pharaoh." And so he's writing this amazing story. There's going to be times for each of us when we experience success in our callings. And these are the moments, when Jesus says to the disciples, "Don't rejoice over the fact that the demons go out before you. Rejoice over the fact that your names are written in the book of life." In other words, you're getting written into this story. I'm the one writing it. Don't be so impressed that I did something through you. Don't get arrogant or prideful. I was the one who did that. Be excited that you got to be a part of the story and be grateful that, I've been setting you free. And there's going to be the times when we hit those massive, difficult places. And if we're in the place of fear, we might be crippled and think we can't do it and not step out in faith. And if we're in the place of pride or entitlement because we've seen things go well, then we might get like Moses at the end and become bitter and resentful and feel really frustrated or disenfranchised by the calling. The truth is, our calling, it's not about us. This isn't about God has some design for Tim's life that I have to fulfill in order to prove myself to God or to other people. It's that God is drawing me into his narrative. He has called us together to be a part of a beautiful story that's a generational story, and that we get to be a part of the legacy. We're part of a global story. And so God is working across the generations and across the nations, but we have our own part to play. Individually, we have a part to play. And then us here in Southeastern Pennsylvania, when we get around the tables we want to look at, we're a team, and God's called us to this time and this place right now. We're in the same geography, serving, essentially the same culture and within the same geographic region. What is this communal call? How are we a part of a team, and how would God have us collaborate in a way that can lead his people into the new place of freedom? What are the shackles that he wants to set people free from in this time and in this moment? And how do we play our part in the generational call? That's what I want us to be meditating on when we get to the tables, and actually going to take us in a whole other direction in terms of our calling for processing. But this is the backdrop to think about our calling, not just as an individual thing, but part of a story that God's writing, and the privilege of being able to be a part of that. I hope it encourages you, and looking forward to seeing you at the table and your voice being a part of this.
Go ahead and get on over to netzer.org/gather and sign up today for the One Church Leaders Gathering, August 27th at the Sheraton Valley Forge, 9 a.m. till noon. I'll see you there.